Good morning, everyone. Welcome again to Music 1300. I am your host, Professor George. We are going to talk once more about timbre, a totally different element of timbre. We're going to leave the string quartet completely aside and talk about things that are new in the 20th century. Well, even though we're in the 21st century, there are a lot of things that were discovered and reinvented in the 20th century. And we're going to cover 4 different composers, one in each section, and talk about the significance of, unfortunately, just men. We'll cover some women later on in the semester, but we're going to talk about the invention of new instruments mainly through the works of John Cage, Harry Partch, Edgar Varese, and Luigi Russolo. So 4 very wildly different thinkers. Some have a little bit of intersecting circles to them, but we're going to take a look at each of them and some pivotal writings or works that they created that were definitely new and novel for their time and had sort of a great impact on artists to follow. So the first composer and philosopher and performance artist and thinker that we're going to talk about is John Cage. And he's one of my favorite composers that we'll discuss all semester. Lots of favorites for me, but John Cage, I'm going to definitely play some lectures and some lecture snippets and some of his works. But what was interesting about John Cage in particular was how he thought about music. He was incredibly interested, much like I am, about how people listen to music and what even defines music or art for that matter. He was born in 1912 and lived till 1992 and was important it also in interdisciplinary collaboration, worked very closely with a choreographer and dancer, Merce Cunningham, and worked on a number of really important collaborations and stepping the interest in avant-garde choreography in combination with music forward. A lot of interesting works by the two of them. Great. So at this point, I'm gonna just toggle over to my lecture notes. No whiteboard for today. I don't think we need to draw anything on the whiteboard, but let me lecture over some of the things that I've written about John Cage, and we'll watch some lectures about him and listen to some pieces. Okay, so here we go. Lecture notes for this this lecture. John Cage. Okay, so he's an American composer, but I forgot to mention that. He was also particularly important historically because he used this thing we call indeterminacy or chance element in terms of the pre-compositional procedure. We've talked about pre-compositional design a little bit when we discussed Steve Reich and his use of phasing within music, the idea of taking an idea and putting it through a musical system. So John Cage has this idea of indeterminacy. Let me give you an example. We're going to use a regular 6-sided die, and each number is going to represent a different musical element. Let's consider it, or just one dimension or different dimensions of one particular musical element. So let's say it's about rhythm. The 1 represents a whole note, the 2 represents a half note, the 3 unfortunately represents a quarter note, etc., and it goes down the rhythm scale. So instead of me as a composer determining what rhythms come next, I would perhaps roll the die in order to determine what was going to happen. And that's what we call chance procedure in music. Chance. It's a part of pre-compositional design, but it's very, very specifically letting go of that. And John Cage was very interested in this idea of control and who is making the music. let's see, like I mentioned, one of his important collaborators was Merce Cunningham. They both integrated a lot of chance and indeterminacy within both of their respective artistic domains. So for John Cage within the musical parameters, for Merce Cunningham within the movement parameters. So again, that example of a die where like you roll one and it would determine like what movement you would do next in the choreography. So those two artists really close. That's not the only thing that they did, but that's one example of some interesting collaborations between the two of them. Merce Cunningham also happened to be like John Cage's romantic partner, and that was there's some really beautiful footage of the two of them that I'm not going to spend time, unfortunately, going over in lecture. But if you were curious, they had a very fruitful and beautiful, loving, collaborative relationship. The other big thing about John Cage was that he's deeply interested in philosophy. And he was always investigating who was making the art. And to John Cage, it's a triangle between the composer, the performer, and the artist that are all creating the piece of art. So like oftentimes we don't really consider the audience, but the audience is incredibly important within the landscape of performing a piece of music, or even interpreting a live performance, or even a recorded performance. So we're going to listen to 3 different pieces by John Cage. We're going to listen to a piece called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. We're going to listen to inlets, and then we're going to listen to sonatas and interludes. Each of these pieces is completely different in terms of the design, although they have like some overlapping elements. Before we talk about his instrumental works and ever so slightly more performance artworks, there are 2 clips that I want to play. The first of which is, and I'll just introduce them one at a time. I'm going to play first a clip of, here, I'll stop sharing. I'm going to first play a clip of John Cage in his younger years. He was televised doing a performance of his piece Water Walk, and it uses 3 things we're still kind of curious about. What's happening rhythmically in the piece of music, or piece of performance art in this case, what's happening with the texture, and what's happening with the instrumentation. And I'll talk about instrumentation first, because that's our new subject for this, this unit number 2. Sorry, thanks. Instrumentation. What is happening here is we're using something we call found objects, instruments of the everyday that are used in a percussive context or performative context. So the instrumentation here, the word to describe the instruments that are playing is probably a solo percussion setup, where it makes use of different auxiliary instruments. It's also, because it doesn't require a conductor, a kind of chamber ensemble, although it's just for one instrumentalist, so it's better to call it a solo. All right, other things that we're interested in: what's happening rhythmically, what's happening texturally. All right, let's take a look and listen to John Cage's Water Walk. All right, here we go.
Water Walk because it contains water and because I walk during its performance.
That figures, doesn't it? Now, also, 2 things I want you to notice. Over here, Mr. Cage has a tape recording machine, which will provide much of the, will you touch the machine so we can know where it is, which will provide much of the background. Also, he works with a stopwatch. The reason that he does this is because these sounds are in no sense accidental in their sequence. they each must fall mathematically at a precise point. So he watches his watch as he works. He takes it seriously. I think it's interesting. If you are amused, you may laugh. If you like it, you may buy the recordings. John Cage and Water Walk.
Great. Perfect. There's an advertisement in my video now. Ugh. Sorry about that. I'm disappointed. Anyway, isn't that fabulous? John Cage's Water Walk. My absolute favorite is when he starts pushing the toasters off the table. Some of you, I'm sure, are like, you know, maybe outraged. Maybe outraged is a strong word, but definitely like, is this art? Is this music? And why am I watching it? Others of you might be like, this is incredibly entertaining. I am so glad I'm being asked if this is art or if this is music. John Cage, by the way, would have been completely fine with people laughing during his pieces of music. Absolutely, totally 100% okay with it. He wanted people to enjoy things and engage with them as they wanted to. And that's, he's an interesting character because he's both a blend of the very serious and the very abstract, the very specific, and the comical. He never took himself too seriously, and really never considered himself really like a composer so much as just like someone who was around to kind of frame things. Later on in his life, like in the late 80s and I'm pretty sure early 90s, this came out. Uh, John Cage, there's a number of videos and lectures about him and with him, spoke a little bit about silence and the difference between sound and silence. So I'm going to play a clip of him much later on in his life, just so you can see how he sort of, perhaps, in a very general sense, evolved as an artist. And then we'll kind of investigate that through some different works during his life. So hold on, let me pull up some other footage of John Cage speaking. Okay, here we go.
When I hear what we call music, it seems to me that someone is talking, and talking about his feelings or about his ideas of relationships. But when I hear traffic, the sound of traffic here on 6th Avenue, for instance, I don't have the feeling that anyone is talking. I have the feeling that sound is acting. And I love the activity of sound. What it does is it gets louder and quieter, and it gets higher and lower, and it gets longer and shorter. It does all those things which I'm completely satisfied with that. I don't need sound to talk to me. We don't see much difference between time and space. We don't know where one begins and the other stops. So that most of the arts we think of as being in time, and most of the arts we think of as being in space. Marcel Duchamp, for instance, began thinking of thinking of music as being not a time art, but a space art. And he made it a piece called Sculpture Musicale, which means different sounds coming from different places and lasting, producing a sculpture which is sonorous and which remains. People expect listening to be more than listening. And so sometimes they speak of inner listening, or the meaning of sound. When I talk about music, it finally comes to people's minds that I'm talking about sound that doesn't mean anything, that is not inner, but is just outer. And they say, these people who understand that finally say, you mean it's just sounds? Thinking that for something to just be a sound is to be useless. Whereas I love sounds just as they are. And I have no need for them to be anything more than what they are. I don't want them to be psychological. I don't want a sound to pretend that it's a bucket, or that it's a president, or that it's in love with another sound. I just want it to be a sound. And I'm not so stupid either. There was a German philosopher who's very well known, Immanuel Kant, and he said there are two things that don't have to mean anything. One is music, and the other is laughter. Don't have to mean anything, that is, in order to give us very deep pleasure. You know that, don't you? The sound experience, which I prefer to all others, is the experience of silence. And the silence almost everywhere in the world now is traffic. If you listen to Beethoven or to Mozart, you see that they're always the same. But if you listen to traffic, you see it's always different.
Great. Good. So I love watching John Cage speak. Your homework, by the way, which I hope you don't start until after you at least watch and listen to John Cage, is to read a section of his lectures, his lecture transcriptions. So as and a part of his book, Silence. I'm pretty sure I included the entire PDF in Blackboard or Dropbox for you, one of the two. It is, you should read it as though it is not only a lecture, but perhaps like whether or not it is art. So I will give you that kind of hint. Okay, so that's a little bit about John Cage and how he thinks about sound and silence. Specifically regarding the idea of the relationship between the composer, the performer, and the audience, this triangle, John Cage really famously put together a piece of music that's called 4:33, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and that is the duration of the piece. It's for a flexible ensemble, so anywhere between one player and hundreds of players. It is indeed printed on sheet music, but we'll talk about the presentation of the work after we listen to it. I might provide a short performance of it, but let us go and see what 4 minutes and 33 seconds is all about. I forgot to mention when we listened to Water Walk what's happening with the texture and what's happening with the rhythm. Texturally, every sound is equally important, and we had some events that were ongoing at a time. When we had one sound at a time and nothing else supporting it, it was monophonic. If we had one sound that was more obvious and everything else supporting it, was homophonic. But sometimes we had like a cacophony of sounds, we're left with polyphonic as an option. And in regard to the rhythm and meter, we definitely didn't have a sense of organized time, where we're doing something that's really like time-based. And that's kind of like maybe the best way of describing what's happening with the tempo or the rhythm or the meter there, is that we're listening to a time-based score or something that is non-metric, that doesn't adhere to a particular beat or pulse pattern. Okay. We're going to hear a lot of those same sort of tendencies in his other works. 4:33, the performance that we're going to listen to is for a full orchestra with a soloist. The piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, is divided out into 3 different movements. So we'll at least get through the first 2 movements. All right, here we go. So traditionally, like, everyone claps for the orchestra, the soloist comes out, takes a special bow. If this is like the arrangement, everyone takes a seat. Before we begin, typically we also tune. Soloist takes a note. First movement begins. First movement just ended. Beginning of the second movement. Second movement has ended. All right. Piece is a little bit longer, but we'll stop it there for right now. So you guessed it, 4 minutes and 33 seconds is 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. It is indeed printed on sheet music. So there's like a title page, an instruction page that says that you can do this for any single combination of instruments that you wish. And it's up to the performer to divide out or performers to divide out the 4 minutes and 33 seconds in 3 different movements. And there's, for each movement, there's a page, there's a Roman numeral for each movement. So movement number 1, Roman numeral 1, then the word tacit. And the word tacit is very specific in music. It usually comes up like in the context of you're in an orchestra and you happen to be silent for that particular movement. It means to remain silent. So if you happen to be a horn player and the horns aren't used for the one of the movements that has strings only, it says movement number blah and then tacit. That means to like actively remain silent, to be engaged but not make sound. And the important thing here is that, and in any performance of 4 minutes and 33 seconds, that you frame it as though it's a performance. So the orchestra's here, she comes out as a soloist, she gives a note, like it's all framed as though it is supposed to be interpreted as a piece of music. And that was a lot of, well, at least some of John Cage's questions was like, is art anything that you put a frame around? And there were a number of like artists that were also interested in this very idea. Recently, and it's not particularly new, this is from mid-century, right? So like art, the artist who duct taped the banana to the wall, it's the idea of like, when you put a statement in a space, is it art? Or once it's in a gallery, once you framed it that way, is it art? And John Cage asked the very same question about music. And in that same way, asks, who is making the music then? Is it the people on stage, or is it the performer or the people in the audience, or are they equally invested in creating the music for the piece? What I miss so much about doing this in class is that some people would be outraged, and I wouldn't get to even know if you're outraged by this piece of music. Do I sit and listen to John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds all the time? Absolutely not. Do I think it raises some really interesting ideas as to like what is art and how important a framing device is? Absolutely. And I think that question is really important to be raised. So I love at this point, we would probably have at least a 5-minute or 10-minute discussion about whether or not this is a piece of music or not. And certainly something that we're going to discuss very likely via our discussion board if we are on the online medium, which in this case we are. But yeah, is John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds a piece of music? Is it art? You will decide. Very good. We have 2 more pieces of John Cage's that we're going to talk about. The next one is going to be a selection from John Cage's sonatas and interludes. And this whole piece is for solo piano, and it uses something that we call the prepared piano. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself. What's happening rhythmically and texturally and instrumentation-wise for this performance of John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds? Well, instrumentation, it's a full orchestra that's playing this with a soloist. What's happening with rhythm and meter? Well, let's talk about what's happening texturally first. Not one person is more important in the music making than anyone else, and everyone is doing their own thing. I'm going to argue that the texture that we're listening to is non-imitative polyphony. And I think there's a strong case to be made for that, for sure. The idea that like everyone is silent. And by the way, silence doesn't really exist as an idea. No one is actually silent. They're all breathing and making some amount of noise, but everyone is doing it in their own rhythm, their own tempo, their own meter, their own pulse, which also brings me to the fact that it is strangely, in a weird way, polyphonic, or the idea that there's a not a present pulse in the piece of music. Either way you would want to describe it is totally fine by me. But in the 20th century, we sometimes need like different combinations of vocabularies in order to describe what's happening rhythmically and what's happening texturally. All right. Back to sonatas and interludes. This whole piece is for prepared piano, and that is preparing in a piano is an example of an extended technique, using an instrument in a non-traditional way. In this case, the non-traditional way is by sticking nuts and bolts and other hardware and accoutrement inside the piano that modifies the timbre or the tone color of the sound. Let's go ahead and listen to some prepared piano from the sonatas and interludes. Here we go. So that's just a little taste of what's happening within the prepared piano pieces. The movements number 1, 2, 3, and 5 all use the same preparations, but there are combinations of like rubber stoppers that are placed in between the strings in order to get these more percussive sounds. What's happening here is then because you're varying the tone color of the instrument, you are getting more variety in texture, the idea of like different sounds being combined together. The piece is a little disorienting. It feels a little disorganized, likely because there's some chance procedure that's happening here. But we also feel thrown off because texturally, we're a little unsure of what to make of things because things are so percussively driven. There's some call and response, some heterophonic elements, and some more polyphonic elements to it. Don't be confused. Just because there's one player playing one instrument, there's separation of ideas between the left and the right hand. And therefore, like one thing can usually, like one hand accompanies the other. So homophonic texture typically comes up a lot in piano writing. That being said, this one's a little bit more complicated than that, with some call and response elements and some polyphonic elements just due to the timbral variety of the piece. Additionally, really weird things happening with rhythm and meter here. No sense of regular pulse, very likely dealing with asymmetrical or mixed meter. Everything is kind of like sparse and not quite so organized, so more likely that it's an example of mixed meter than asymmetrical, which tends to have a recurring pattern, but not necessarily. Okay, let's listen to, and of course, instrumentation, solo piano. It happens to be prepared, which is an extended technique. Let's listen to one more John Cage piece. It is called Inlets, written in 1977. This piece is for a percussion ensemble, so that's the instrumentation, where everyone is playing found objects, seashells. There's also an element of indeterminacy with this piece. It's a text-based piece, which John Cage was really interested in creating. The idea is that you fill your shell with water and kind of move it this way and that in order to create a gurgling effect. And that gurgling effect is incredibly random based on the shell that you pick and a number of other factors. So let's take a listen to a little bit of John Cage's Inlets.